So, because I've been thinking about God and all of the implications of the theory and all that, I finally think I figured it out. The theory that I've been working on can be reduced to just a theory of mind, because what I'm really saying is that the establishment or iteration of nothing is the building of a reference frame, which happens because when nothing pervades all of existence, or all there was nothing, then all there was nothing. There wasn't anything except nothing, and nothing was all that there was, and so that constitutes one nothing. It constitutes a nothing. It constitutes a happening of the nothing, or an iteration. The iteration happens because of the inability for any consequence other than one consequence, other than a single consequence can possibly be the case. It's the eradication of all other possibilities. There are no other possibilities except it. So, given nothing, the only possibility, most people would say, would be nothing. Well, here's the problem, and here's the paradox. Is nothing the cause or the effect? Is nothing the premise or the conclusion? Now, if you say, given nothing, nothing must be the conclusion, well, that's two things at the same time. If you put nothing as a premise and then you get nothing back as a conclusion, you're still using logic in between the premise and the conclusion. So, given truly nothing, there would not be logic to conclude anything, because you wouldn't be given a premise. There would not be a premise. And so this is what happens when we don't put any God before God. So that I can't say that that's where God came from. I can't say that God came from the nothing. And then worship the nothing. And then say that the nothing is the real God, because that's what gives birth to everything else, or something like that. That there's some intrinsic, innate value to nothing, or a personhood to nothing, or something like that. Which I went through a lot of. I had a very long, dark spell where I did value the nothing, and I felt like it was the birthplace of God and all of that. Now, if we say that, well, given that there's nothing, then there is one nothing. It does actually exist. It iterates. If you say that, then you're saying that things iterate automatically, that things iterate without God. And so then the act of iterating, which is really what I think most people would consider to be creation, would be something that would be automatic. Now, if it is automatic, then there really isn't a God. Then it would just be everything is a natural consequence of nothing, or there being nothing. Because then everything can be derived from that. Because once we have the successful establishment of one nothing, one totality of nothing, one instance in which there was nothing, or something like that, it also automatically becomes a paradox, because like I said, you've got a cause and yet an effect, and they're separated by this deductive reasoning. So where did this deductive reasoning come from, that we're able to arrive at the conclusion of nothing given the premise of nothing? Given also the fact that a premise of nothing is logically equivalent in some ways, but I don't know if it's logically equivalent in all ways, to no premise. Because to not have a premise is not the same thing as having a premise. Even if it's a premise of nothing, it's still a premise. And this is kind of the difference between there being zero nothings and there being one nothing. So if there is one, nothing, if there actually was a happening of nothing, then we have the establishment of one from zero. We have the establishment of nothing happening, and therefore there being such a thing as happening, or what I call iteration, which is the inability for anything except it to have been there, given deductive reasoning. And then I say that deductive reasoning is evolution, because all it's saying is given some random process, so really given any process, you're going to have some kind of an output which is orderly, even if you start from disorder. And that if given nothing, that you would automatically have an arrangement of nothing, and you can say that. But it's an assertion nonetheless. I can't say that for certain. All I can say is that that's one way of looking at it. Now, the problem with looking at it that way is that you don't really have a God anymore. You have the nothing. Now, all kinds of freaky ass shit happens when you say that nothing actually happened and that everything came out of nothing. In many ways, the consequences are kind of what drove me away from it. Eventually, I got so afraid that I ran to God, and I ran back to the Bible, and I just started to rediscover my belief in it, because it got to the point where I could no longer reconcile these paradoxes, and it turned everything into a paradox, because it was all derived from this paradox of nothing being nothing, and this happening of nothing. And this eerie suspicion that somehow I made some statement which could be technically accurate, but it might be extremely subjectively misleading. Which is to say that it might be like true in the strict formal technical sense, but it isn't true to life. It isn't true to any spiritual understanding. It's something that would be considered true to a mind, but not to a soul. So it's like, because the idea of everything coming from nothing, and that the periphery of everything necessitates that there's nothing beyond everything also, that we all came from nothing and that we're all destined to become nothing, doesn't really seem to have much room for purpose. So it got really scary and freaky. But the idea, it still kind of rests there in my head. I'm not quite ready to shake it yet. If there was nothing, then there was a was. If nothing happened, there was a happening, not nothing. So this assertion of deductive reasoning penetrating into nothing just bakes the answer right into the question. It just puts deductive reasoning in as the input, and then it gets it back as the output. So, I think what that means then is that in the sense that I'm trying to use my mind to answer the questions, I eventually just ended up with my mind, because I wasn't capable of encountering nothing, so I brought my mind with me. And after I got rid of all the stuff that I thought was in my mind, and then I got rid of that, and then I got rid of that, and then I got rid of that, eventually I got to the point where the only thing that I had in my mind was my mind. And so then I started to have this like infinite feedback loop kind of thing happen, where you're like looking at yourself in the mirror, and yet there's another mirror behind you, and so then there's an infinite series of your own reflection back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So yeah, there is a loop that you can find there. There is an integration, a crystallization of all deductive reasoning into one system. But that doesn't mean that that's all reality is, or even what God is. It just means that's what our minds are doing when we're using this deductive reasoning we get deductive reasoning as the output because that's what you put in. Now, then what we say is if we're going to start with actual real nothing, then we can't talk of having one nothing. We have one reference frame, or we have a referent of nothing inside of a deductively logical reference frame. But we don't have actual nothing. We have a conception of nothing. We have an image of nothing. So it's like an empty chair. It's not that there's nothing there. It's that there's a chair there, but there's just not anyone sitting in it. So it's an empty chair. It's an empty box. It's an empty something. And the something that contains that nothing is then infected with it and infects it. And so it's kind of like a survival test of integration. Is the thing capable of existing if it were to confront nothing? In the case of deductive reasoning, yes, it can. But it has to already, of course, exist. But if it were to encounter nothing, yes, it could encounter nothing and still survive it, because deductive reasoning, being the only input, will also get you the same output. In other words, it doesn't contradict itself. It just affirms itself. If you were to have a box that's empty and then you put deductive reasoning into the box, then when you open the box, there will still be deductive reasoning intact in the same condition that you left it in when you put it in the box. Now, if you were to take a cat and you were to put that in, it wouldn't survive. Nothing. Because its lungs would explode and its blood would boil and blah, blah, blah. And then you'd have to talk about like matter evaporating into energy and stuff like that. It's like there's not really a way of describing what that is anymore, because we've reached the limits of physics, etc. And by the time the atoms get ripped apart from each other, we don't really have any more words left to call whatever that is. I guess it would be 0-point energy or latent heat energy. That would be all that's left of the cat if it were in a real, pure, absolute vacuum. That's what would happen. Whereas if you put deductive reasoning into a vacuum, it can survive it, because all of its pieces fit together and it doesn't need to breathe or have blood pressure or guts or any physical substrate. So it just sits there and is perfectly fine as an abstraction in some void space. That's cool. Totally fine. It's totally consistent. But when someone says that given nothing, nothing can be the only consequence, that's absurd. Because it's saying that when you have nothing as your premise, that it's exactly the same thing as not having a premise. And how can you draw a conclusion without having a premise? So if you say that from nothing there must come nothing, then you're making a premise out of nothing, because you're saying from nothing. That's a premise, from nothing. Well, we don't have that premise. We have nothing. We don't have the premise of nothing, and from the premise of nothing only what comes? The conclusion that we had the premise of nothing. I mean, there's not really a way of discerning what that would be. And you can't describe what the equality is between not having a premise and having a premise of nothing. It's the same thing as not typing the number 0 on your calculator and typing the number 0 on your calculator. Well, that could make a huge difference if you're talking about the difference between 1 and 10, or 10 billion to 1. Well, you need the zeros. You need to be able to type those zeros. They have value. There's expression in them. But when you don't put any number into the calculator, it's not equivalent to typing 0 into the calculator. Just because it's an expression of nothing doesn't mean that it's completely devoid of any value. It just takes the place of all the other numerical values and replaces it with 0. And that's an expression of an impression. That's an expression of 0. It's not, like implied, or it's not just thought about it's put into the calculator in order for it to work properly. But to not type it in and to say, well, there's just nothing, well, then you don't have a premise to gain a conclusion from. Because you didn't type anything into the calculator, you're not going to get any kind of a response. Because you don't make a premise, you don't make a conclusion. So it isn't to say that given nothing, nothing is the only possible conclusion. It is to say, given deductive reasoning is the only possible conclusion. And it is to say, given some premise, then a conclusion which doesn't contradict its premise must follow. But it doesn't say anything about what nothing is, or that you can draw a conclusion from nothing. Because you can't draw a conclusion from nothing, otherwise you could have conclusions without premises. And if you could have conclusions without premises, then we would never have to assert anything. Everything would just become self-evident. Because there wouldn't be any room for error, because there can't be such a thing as a contradictory truth. So then, if all truths are derived from either other truths or base fundamental axioms, then we can reduce everything to base fundamental axioms. And if the base fundamental axioms are true, then everything else must be true, because if I have true premises, then a true conclusion must follow. So, all that being said, if I don't make a premise, then I can't make a conclusion. I cannot draw a conclusion without a premise. I can assert a premise without a preceding conclusion, logically. And that's called an assertion or an axiom. And you have to make at least one axiom before you can make a theory. All logical systems are dependent upon at least one axiom. You can't derive any of them from nothing. So it cannot then be the case that you can just derive logic from nothing. You can't say that from nothing there must have come nothing, because you're not in a position to apply relativity to something that doesn't exist. It isn't there to have the relativity applied to it, because it's nothing. So you can't encapsulate that into a premise and then claim that you've drawn a substantial conclusion. Your conclusion will be just as vapid as the premise. If you have nothing in your premise, you have nothing in your conclusion, and therefore you have no conclusion and you have no premise. Because if you're going to put logical validity in between nothing and nothing, then there's not anything there to have the logic applied to. Now, if you were to say that it's somehow reified, where you're like, well, there is a nothing, and so then I'm applying the deductive logic to it, and I'm saying that given it must be its own effect, that it causes itself. Well, to give it a self and then say that it causes itself is very strange, because to say nothing causes nothing is not equivalent to saying that there is no cause of nothing necessarily. And I've gone back and forth on this so many times. Is it really possible to reify nothing or not? Because if you can't reify nothing, which is what my original presupposition assertion was, that you can't reify nothing. It's not possible to reify nothing. You can certainly treat it as itself. It's just that it's distinct from everything else. That was my original presupposition. Lately, as I've gotten more into the Bible, I've gotten very wary of saying it, because I feel like it contradicts the Bible, especially the commandment that we can't have any gods before God. So I can't say that we must begin with nothing without making an assertion, and that assertion isn't necessary. And that's why the premise of nothing is not the same thing as nothing. Because when I presume that nothing is the origin, that's not the same thing as presuming nothing. That's not the same thing as not presuming anything, for example. It's presuming that nothing is the origin, and that from it everything else can be derived. So When somebody makes the statement, from nothing, nothing must come, or the only logical conclusion that we can draw, given the premise of nothing is nothing, or the conclusion of nothing, then what they're saying is that there's nothing there for anything to come out of. And so then the consequence of that must be itself, because there isn't anything there to come from. So you can't derive anything because there's nothing there to derive from. But if that really were the case, then you wouldn't be able to presume it because there isn't anything there to presume. Just like there isn't anything there to be derived from, there also can't be anything there to be presumed. So there also can't be anything that can be concluded. And if that's the case, then weirdly, it isn't the case that given nothing, nothing must follow. It's actually the opposite. We can't draw that conclusion. We can draw pretty much any other conclusion except that one, but we can't draw it because that's smuggling in deductive reasoning. We're not presuming nothing when we say from nothing, then nothing must follow. We're saying, given the fact that we have presumed that nothing is true, then we can derive from the fact that nothing is true the conclusion that nothing is true. And what does that mean? What does it mean for there to be nothing that is true? Well, it's a self-refuting statement. It means that everything is false, including the statement that everything is false, which means that everything is not false. So then there isn't a conclusion that's being drawn from nothing. There's a conclusion that's being drawn from the premise of believing that nothing is true. Now, if you believe that nothing is true, then you can't have truth because you're not capable of sustaining that statement. It contradicts itself. If you say nothing is true, then everything is false, including nothing is true. Nothing is true is then false by necessity. So then you can play these liar's paradox games and say, but if it's false, then it's true. Because it's false, it must then become true. But that's not true. That's a difference between the output and the input. If you take, or you could say it's orders of logic. If you take the premise that nothing is true as true, then you must conclude that everything is false. And then you must conclude from that conclusion that nothing is true is false. And then you must conclude from that conclusion that that conclusion is false. And so then it just goes back and forth and oscillates between being considered true and false over and over. In fact, it's a double negation. It's either a singular negation or it's a double negation. And that's what gives you the paradoxical oscillation in between it being true and false. And it just depends on how many times, whether an even or odd number of times, that you draw the implication. So if you treat the very first premise that nothing is true, and you assume that's true, so that has a truth value. Now then after that's established as true, after that you draw the next conclusion. The implication of the premise that nothing is true is that everything is false. And then after that conclusion has been drawn, then you draw the conclusion that therefore the statement nothing is true is itself false. Now, the implication at that point is 3 deep, so that's an odd number. So that makes it, I think it's, false? Because that's a triple negation? No. Yeah, false. So nothing is true is treated as true. Everything is false is considered true. And then nothing is true is false is considered true. But yet, inside those premises, their values shift. So it has to deal with how you're looking at it, from the outside in or the inside out. But it's not really a paradox. Like, it's not an erroneous paradox. It's a paradox that gets resolved by splitting orders of logic, or sequence of implications. So, first, nothing is true. Second, everything is false. Third, nothing is true is false, and so on. But the reason that that matters is because each of those conclusions is derived from the thing before it. So, because they're all dependent on the thing before it, that's what causes the oscillation. When you put negation in, then you negate the negation, you get a double negation, which flips the truth value back to where it was originally. And then you add a third negation, and two of those cancel each other out, and you have one remaining. And so then a triple negation is the same thing as a single negation, which gives you a false value. And then if you have four negations, then you have two double negations, which all cancel out, and you get the original truth value. And so you get this oscillation back and forth between true and false and true and false, depending on if it's an odd or an even number of negations. And all that really means is as soon as you separate all of those oscillations where you say it's one negation in the first premise, it's two negations in the second premise, it's three negations in the conclusion, four negations in the consequence of the conclusion, etc., 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 such that there is a negation for every order of logic that you use, then you can see that it gets resolved if you use I guess you'd call it a recursive algorithm rather than it just being a normal algorithm. It has a recursion where the output of one iteration becomes the input of the next iteration. And that's what gives you the oscillation, and that's what gives you a separation between which statements are true and which statements are false, given the sequence of implications. How many times did you process it? Did you process it once, twice, three times? And however many times you process it, it will give you either a truth or a falsehood for that iteration. And half of those iterations are true and half of those iterations are false. And that's why you end up with a total output of half and half, or paradox. It's both true and yet false, or it's true because it's false, and it's false because it's true. And that's what happens with the liar's paradox and any other absolute negation thought experiment, including nothing being nothing. So, because negation is kind of like how math is zero is supposed to be analogous to nothing, logic has the operation of negation, which is supposed to be analogous to nothing. Now, interestingly enough, Peano showed that if you use nothing but negations and parentheses to nest them in particular orders, you can actually create every logical operation. Disjunction, conjunction, negation, equivalence, all of those things can all be derived from negations and parentheses. The reason that that's interesting for me is because my theory also says that after you get this nothing, which is equivalent to a negation, you automatically have to have limits, which are the parentheses, which encapsulate it into one unit, which is unique. And so all these recurring integrated parts with each other means that the deductive system of logic is integrated and it's logically valid. It affirms itself, but yet it cannot be proven or disproven beyond itself because it encapsulates an entire field. And a field is all possible points or all possible positions. So there are no positions which are not it unless they're an entirely different field, which, like I say, you can find paradoxes there, but they're always resolvable if you can discern one field from another and you use that line of discernibility to separate out the paradoxes. So, all of that is to say that you cannot draw a conclusion from no premise. You can't draw a conclusion from just nothing. You can't say that given nothing, I can draw some conclusion, even if the conclusion is, again, nothing. It's still not a valid conclusion because you drew it from nothing. You didn't draw it from a premise. You drew it from nothing. So you can't just derive logic out of nothing. You're asserting it, fine, but you can't derive it and claim that it's absolutely true. It's possible, but that doesn't make it necessary. There are other alternatives to that assertion, such as the assertion that in between nothing and deductive logic, there's God, and that God created deductive reasoning so that all of us could understand what's going on. You could use that assertion, and that one requires a God, at which point you're going to have to define God, and then you're going to have to use subjective art to justify your choice of defining what God is, because there's no room for relativity. God is an absolute. God is the creator of all things. So then God cannot be anything, even a giant field, even all the fields. That still isn't God because God's bigger than that. Created even that. So if God created everything, then God cannot be anything. God can't even be nothing. So then we have to acknowledge that any logical theory, at the very least, asserts deductive reasoning itself. It doesn't necessarily do that. It could have something other than deductive reasoning at its core, and then it just happens to have deductive reasoning hanging out somewhere, or it doesn't even have deductive reasoning in it at all. You don't necessarily have to have deductive reasoning. It's not necessary. You can discount it. You can say that it's just a fluke or a series of coincidences, or that I just don't see it. Prove it. And there is no way to really prove it to somebody who doesn't want to see it. They just won't. There's not really any explicit, objective way of affirming that that's actually real. In the same way that numbers are considered real by most people, but yet no one's ever seen one. I mean, you'll see a picture of a number, but you'll never see the number one, like somewhere hanging out in space or something. You're never going to find the number one. You'll find pictures of the number one. You'll find examples of the number one, but you'll never find the number one itself. And so when we acknowledge that that's the case for numbers, then we can also acknowledge that that's the case for deductive logic itself, because that's where all numbers come from. And, you know, the limit of discernibility is where we're deriving from necessity that we have deductive reasoning. Because if we don't have deductive reasoning, then we can't discern. And if we want to discern, then there must be deductive reasoning being employed in order to discern. So if we want to believe that discernibility is even possible, which it may not really be in an absolute sense, we can't see what God sees. So from an absolute perspective, we don't have discernibility and can't have it. But if you wanted to be an engineer about it and say, well, you know, pragmatically, it seems to be the case that, and it's sufficient to me that there is such a thing as deductive reasoning, well, then yeah, you can have it. But it's not necessary, it's just sufficient. It could be the case, but it doesn't have to be. So making that assertion, like applied explicitly in the theory, is apparently necessary, and it is necessary in order to create that line of discernibility in between the theory and the subjective world that determined what its axioms and its assertions were. So all I'm saying is that in order to derive the logical system in its entirety, you just have to assert that its basic function of implication exists. Now, as long as you assert the function of implication, then you can process anything that you want deductively. And implication is pretty simple. It just has to deal with relativity. It just means, do the parts contradict themselves or the whole? If they don't, you're golden. It's a thing. If they do, it's not a thing. And it's false, and it doesn't exist, and it's gibberish, and it's non sequitur, it's an error. Logically invalid, disintegrated part with no sustainable whole. So we just say that those things just don't exist, and then we say the things that are logically valid do exist, and then we say that if it's possible that something exists, then we just go ahead and assume that at least it's possible. And only if it's impossible do we say that it's an error. And then the process of implication is just a survey of anything that we can think of where it doesn't contradict the premise that we're assuming is true. And like I said, you always have to have a premise. In this case, the premise is simple. Deductive logic is always functioning. The function of implication is always present. And the function of implication is defined as there must always be an effect correspondent to its cause, such that if there is a cause present, then there is the effect present. And if the cause is absent, then the effect is also absent. And that gives you the law of cause and effect, which is the same thing as the function of implication. So, given that, then you can derive that right back. It's self-affirming. It doesn't contradict itself. You put nothing in there, and you will not get nothing back. You won't get anything back. You will not get anything at all. It'll be like trying to record silence. Like, there will be a file that is on your computer that says, you know, it recorded 7 seconds. And you're like, oh, okay, well, let's play it. There's just nothing there. There's just silence. Now, the file isn't corrupted, it plays, but all you did was record silence. So as far as it's concerned, it's indiscernible from just not playing it, except for the fact that you can go on the screen and press the play button and it scrolls along as if it were playing something. So, being that that's the case, you can discern whether or not the file exists. You can download it, you can transfer it, you can make it so substantial that it fills up all the storage space in somebody's archives and they can no longer download anything else because it's stuffed full of 7 seconds of silence repeated over and over and over until there's no more room. So it obviously fills some gap. And that's what makes it not the same thing as just not simply recording anything at all. And it's that simple recognition of a very subtle difference that makes it possible to then say stupid things like, from nothing, nothing must follow. It's stupid. You cannot draw a conclusion given no premise. And you can't say that nothing is a premise because it's nothing. There isn't anything there to presume. So, having said all of that, it is not then necessarily the case that everything came from nothing. It just means that even something as absent as nothing, I can conceptualize subjectively. And I can say, the concept of nothing is so vapid and so indiscernible that I can't draw any conclusion from it. But even that still isn't nothing. We're a lot closer. We've got a much better conclusion now. Given that we don't have a premise, we can't draw any discernible conclusion. Given an indiscernible premise, we can't derive a discernible conclusion, because we can't even discern what the premise is that we're trying to conclude from. We don't have enough conviction in the premise to be able to say if it's true or false, because it won't fit in any of those categories. It's somewhere in between. Depends on what it is, depends on what time of day it is, it depends on something, but we don't know what, and we can't figure out what it is. So, rather than starting from nothing, I assert that all there is the deductive field of logic. And when I do that, then I place nothing beyond it, and then it confronts nothing. And then the theory proceeds like it did before, without the explicit statement that there is nothing there. And by doing that, then I really, truly, accurately confront nothing with deductive reasoning. And like I said, it survives simply because all of its parts are non-contradictory. So it constitutes a valid, logically valid, self-affirming system. And indeed, it proves itself to be able to do this. And that's its feat. It's not that you can simply derive it from nothing. It's that if you assert that it's true, then it won't fail you. You'll always get an accurate answer. But you have to assert that it's true first, and therein lies the trouble. Because what that does is it allows an atheist to be able to explain basically every question that you might have as a religious person. From what is the meaning of life, to evolve, to use deductive reasoning to its maximum capabilities. And its result is always the same. You can start with any chaotic environment you want to, even a paradox, like nothing being nothing, for example. And if you assert that paradox and you shove in some irresolvable paradox that no one's ever been able to figure out, like nothing is nothing, like what does that even mean? Does that mean that there is not a thing there to be nothing? And am I reifying nothing when I say nothing is nothing? Or am I just saying that there isn't such a thing as nothing? And it's so subtle that you can't actually explicitly, you can't tease that apart. The only way that you can is if you start defining like what being is. And if you say being is just non-contradiction again, which is just the reassertion of logic once again, in between nothing and nothing, where nothing is nothing, and is deductive logic, then you just sandwiched again the deductive system back into the same thing that it was before, which is you've got nothing on one end, deductive reasoning, and then nothing on the other end. And it's deductive reasoning surrounded on all fronts, confronting nothing directly. And so what happens when you do that is, from any paradox or any kind of irresolvable paradox, if it truly is erroneous, then you can derive any conclusion that you want. And so then that is its own state, which is a state of indiscernibility. And so then while we don't have actual indiscernibility, we discern that there is indiscernibility, and that's totally different. So now it's all encapsulated inside this reference frame, all neat and tidy. And it keeps itself very clean. Even if you put a paradox like that in there, it'll just resolve it. And what it does is it packets things. It puts things in certain pockets, and it says, okay, over here is the nothing that we're considering. Over there is the indiscernibility that follows from it. And over here is our ability to discern that indiscernibility from the nothing, preceding it. And so doing that makes everything about nothing from nothing make sense. Because the statement from nothing must follow. That statement is just a very compressed, haphazard way of saying what I just said. And that's a completely different state, because then what we have is not nothing at the end, like the statement says. What we have is, we have three instances going on at the same time. The original premise of nothing, the indiscernible consequence thereof, and the discernibility of that consequence from its predecessor. And because we have those three reference, we can then derive the rest of everything else that follows, because now we have our negation, and we have our parentheses, we have our nested operations, and we have the ability to discern indiscernibility from nothing. So then we also have the limit of discernibility, and the definition of discernibility is just being able to tell what something is from what it isn't, to be able to exclude everything that something is not and include everything that something is. And that's the line of discernibility of that. And then after having established all that, then we can derive all the rest of the operations of logic. And we can derive mathematics as the relations between proximities or degrees of spatial distance, just like we could derive the distance between nothing and its consequence, and the consequence of that consequence. That's more temporal than spatial, but you could attribute a spatial environment to it too. And you can use modes, and you can use modal logic in order to do that. And you can say each of these is occupying a specific world. There is a world in which there is nothing. And then the consequence of that world of nothing is then indiscernibility. The one world in which there is nothing, which would just be like a wasteland. So all of that stuff means that we can't say anything about God, because we have to assert deductive reasoning first. And I want to keep the theory clean, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But if you wanted to, you could project further and go into the artistic evaluation of subjectively evaluating why or how one should value deductive reasoning. And you can come up with all kinds of artistic, subjectively valuable justifications for that axiom if you want to. And then that would be your reason for there being a logical field, which would then fit along with this theory as the creator of that, which would then be God. But again, none of that can or ever will necessitate the conclusion that there is a God, or that we know what God's will is, or that we know where a soul is going at death. We don't have the ability to know that. We can logically derive it from an assertion that we make, but we make these assertions using subjectivity not relativity. And so then the justification for those axioms being used or not depends really solely upon your subjective artistic bent, not your raw calculating logical deductive reasoning powers. You can't deduce God. It just can't be done. I've tried. And I failed. But in my failure, I succeeded in something that I didn't even know I could do, which is to build a theory of mind and save deductive reasoning from the grips of the postmodernists who claim that it doesn't exist. You can claim that. Okay, but if you do, then you can't argue anything. In other words, if you say, I don't want to go to this play, I don't want to go to any plays, then don't get on the fucking stage and don't sit in the audience seat. You're done, you're out of here, you don't want to be here anyway, go away. So the postmodernists, while they can claim that there's no such thing as logic and that there's no such thing as a way of determining the intent of the author, etc., there are ways of determining it if you assume that the author is rational. If you assume that the author has access and believes in deductive reasoning, then, lo and behold, magically it becomes possible to deduce the reasoning. Huh. But if you're a postmodernist author, then no, because then you don't believe in logic and you just think everything is an art form. Okay, fine, yeah, you can reduce everything to art if you want to. And you can say that it's all art, all the time, every time, even science is art, etc. You can claim all that, but then you can't argue anything because everything that you say is just some assertion, some baseless assertion hanging in the air. And there's no way that even you would be able to know what you mean when you say something because you won't be able to ascertain the relativity and logical deducibility of what you're saying. You'll only ever have, you won't even have induction, let alone deduction. You'll have intuition, but that's it. And your intuition is as good as mine. It could be equal, it could be unequal, it could be non-existent. Maybe there's not even an intuition. There's no way of determining it. So, if you really want to be a postmodernist, be a post-postmodernist and claim that postmodernism is ended. It may as well just refute itself because it doesn't have any bearing on anything other than shoving your fist as far as you can up your ass, elbow deep. But whatever, like I said, it is a choice. And yeah, exercise it. Read Foucault. Do all that. Read Derrida. Go ahead, read. Read all you want. But just realize that at the end of all of these statements is the same question hanging in the air. Why can't I just say that about you? So like when the nihilist says everything is false, well then why can't I just say that about what you just said? Oh, well, there's no meaning in anything. Well, then I guess there's no meaning in saying that there's no meaning in anything. So when something becomes self-refuting, as a person who does believe in the deducibility of all things, I don't believe that you can just say self-refuting things like that and then just get away with it because you like Nietzsche's flair. I like Nietzsche's flair too, but even Nietzsche wasn't a dumbass. He always knew that it was pointing at something else that did mean something intrinsically. And he used to call it, what did he say, a life force, or that you always have to be true to life. That if you have a philosophy that isn't true to life, that it isn't worth having. And if you're using some measure other than that, other than life, then you're not really using any measure at all. So, you know, you can go up against that and you can say whatever you want to say and it'll be quote unquote equally valid and blah, 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 but it'll also be self-refutational. So why should I take it seriously? If it doesn't take itself seriously, then how can I take it seriously? So you can claim all these things. And it is a choice. And I choose to laugh at it and call it stupid. but then so do they. And who's to say which one is actually right? Well, that's an art versus a philosophy. It doesn't fit. It's comparing apples to oranges. There's no room on the stage for this silliness. You can't have a debate between a postmodernist and a modernist. You can't have a debate between two postmodernists. You can't even have an introspection of a postmodernist. You can't do it because there's no relativity. They don't believe in relativity. They only believe in subjectivity. Everything's an art form. Well, then there's nothing there for us to say to each other. It's just words. It could mean anything. It could be anything. It could be nothing. It could be a bunch of vapid noise. It could be a fart in the wind. It could be an orchestrating, flamingo dancing ballet parade. Who the fuck knows what it is? So then I can't really draw any conclusion unless I'm drawing an artistic conclusion, at which point I can't apply that within the field of logic because art and logic are not the same things. And so that's all we can really say, is that they're two completely distinct worlds, and while these paradoxes may exist, they only exist until or unless we choose to resolve them by separating the worlds, at which point we have one world occupied by postmodernists, which is totally subjective, and then we have another world which is occupied by logicians and people that believe in deductive logic, and that goes as far as it goes. And they can't exceed their own limits into each other's limits. So they're just kept separate but equal. And that's the only way that you can do it. It's the only way that makes any sense, because anything else would be one absorbing the other or one destroying the other, and it can't be done because it's like trying to shout a sight for someone to see. Like, it doesn't matter how loud I scream if the person is deaf, and it doesn't matter how obvious and bright and shiny the visuals are if I'm blind. So this is a deaf person screaming and a blind person doing charades. Kind of a thing when we talk about postmodernists debating modernists. It just can't be done. There cannot be such a thing as that. So it's up to the audience's choice always, but I think the fact that that choice even exists is enough of a reason to be a logician and say that logic does exist. I wouldn't be able to argue the point if it weren't. Now, from a postmodernist view, that doesn't make sense, because you can just say that logic either exists or doesn't exist inside the field of subjectivity. But as soon as you go outside the field of subjectivity into the field of relativity or the field of objectivity, then you get confronted again with the necessity for relativity, and thus the necessity for logic. You can't argue for any science, which is the study of objectivity, the study of the field of objects, without simultaneously arguing for the theory of logic, for there to be a deductive way of reasoning, connecting these objects to an objective total system arrangement, which has relativity throughout it, throughout all the relations between all the objects. You can't have a whole bunch of objects with no relations between them, because only nothing is not related to anything. So, given the fact that science is the study of the objective field and all objects are related to each other, and thus if you have an object, then you have a relation, and the fact that the limits of relativity are such that logic pervades throughout relativity, and it's pure math. It has nothing to deal with physics at that point, in that place. That's just pure logic and relativity in mathematics. And given that the art of ascertaining the meaning or subjective value, I should say, of that object and those relations between those physical objects, or whatever you want to call it, objective forms, whether those are bodies of subjects or bodies of rocks or bodies of planetary mass or whatever the physical bodies are of, as they relate to each other, what is the subjective value of those relations? Yes, postmodernist, yes, that subjective relation is totally arbitrary. It just depends on how you look at it, and there's no way of really ascertaining what that subjective value is. That is true. However, there is also no ability to logically ascertain any subjective value of anything because they're subjective. They're beyond the limits of relativity. One should not be in the expectation of being able to make subjective evaluations of relativities unless you just choose to assert them. You can't justify those. They're just done because they are arbitrarily chosen, subjectively valued to be done. But that only goes insofar as their subjective value. That does not go into the existence or non-existence of objects, or the existence or non-existence of logic, or the truth or validity of science. It has nothing to do with those, and it can't make those claims because those claims have to deal with fields that are beyond itself. And it's the same, it's not to say that they're superior or inferior. It's just equal in the sense that in other words, an artist can't tell a scientist that they're wrong because they're not qualified, in the same way that a scientist isn't qualified to tell an artist that they're wrong. You can't have somebody somehow objectively prove that Bob Ross is a better painter than Michelangelo. You just can't do it. You're going to be limited to subjective evaluations, not scientific objective facts. It works both ways. And you also can't do it to a logician or a philosopher or some deductive reasoner, a mathematician or somebody like that. They're all subject to their own fields. They can only make claims about their own fields. They can't make claims about each other. Now, the only claim that I can make that has to deal with the other two is the fact that they aren't in the same field that I'm in. I'm in the field of logic and philosophy. I'm not an artist and I'm not a scientist, but I like to think that I'm a logician. So that's the stage that I like to be on. Now, if there is a postmodernist that wants to shout me down and say that it's all bullshit and there's no such thing as numbers and science isn't real and blah, 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 then I'm going to remind them that they have a voice, I have a voice, and there is no way of determining or ascertaining or measuring the value of one person's voice over another person's voice, because everything that you say is also just some preferential jargon that you invented in your silly head because of your ignorance and education in the specific areas that you have them. Just like me and just like everyone else. And there is no way of favoring or disfavoring one person's view over another. Except yours, because I hate you. And that's how you do that. And that's how you hypocritically disprove your own proof. On your own stage. I'm going to kick myself off my own stage now. Since I kicked everybody else off, now it's time to kick myself off.